There are three ways to control exposure with your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's talk about using the aperture to control exposure. If you look at your eye in dim light, you'll notice the iris opening is very big, so it'll let in more light. Camera lens works the same way. In dim light, you would open the aperture to the wide open setting to let in more light. Again, in very bright light, if you look at your eye, you'll see that the aperture opening or the iris opening is very small. And a camera lens works the same way. To let in less light, use a smaller aperture opening. So there are many possible aperture openings, and these numbers are called f-stops. Now, may be counterintuitive, but the bigger the number, the smaller the opening. But you have to think of them as fractions. So f16, think of a 1/16 is smaller than f2 or 1/2. There just isn't room on that little aperture ring to write it as a fraction or f16. So they just use the numbers. So if you didn't know any better, you would think, wow, 16 is a big number, lets in a lot of light. But it's actually 1/16. Relative aperture is another name for an f number, and there are three variables. The first is focal length. So you can determine the focal length by measuring the distance between the optical center of the lens and the focal plane of the camera when the lens is focused at infinity. So if we take a simple lens like this magnifying glass and we focus the sun on a leaf to burn a hole and then use a ruler to measure it, we'll see that from the optical center to the focal plane, and that would be your film or your sensor, it's 150 millimeters. Relative aperture is another name for an f number. And there are three variables. The first one, of course, is the focal length, and the next one is the effective aperture. The effective aperture is the diameter of the lens opening. So, the diameter of the opening affects the volume of the light. And if you double the diameter, you quadruple the amount of light reaching the film. And the third variable is the lens has to be focused at infinity. Now, if you were using, say, a bellows to make close-ups, you would have to make an exposure compensation because the f numbers would not be the same anymore. That's a case that you probably would rarely run into, though. We have a formula to get the f number, and it's a simple formula. It's the f number is equal to the focal length of the lens divided by the physical diameter of the effective aperture. This is really important because that means f8 is f8 on every lens regardless of its focal length. So if you're using a 24 millimeter lens at f8, the same amount of light reaches the focal plane as a 200 millimeter lens at f8. So small changes in the aperture make big changes in the volume of light. If you increase your f-stop, you let in twice as much light. So if you go from f16 to f11, you're letting in twice as much light. f4 to 2.8, twice as much light. So each stop lets in doubles the amount of light reaching the focal plane. Going the other direction, you multiply by the square root of 2 or 1.4 to get your lens opening. And this is how they actually do it. If you started at f1 and you multiplied by 1.4, the next lens opening getting smaller in the series would be 1.4. Now multiply that again by 1.4 and you get 1.96. But we rounded up to f2. So the numbers on the right hand side of the chart, as you're looking at the screen, change by 1.4, and the numbers on the left hand of the screen as you're looking at it are the actual f-stop numbers that are used. So that's how they determine the series of f numbers. So when you look at a camera lens, again, there's not room to write it as a fraction. So you'll see f16 is a very small opening, f2 is a big opening, and in between are your lens openings. So when you go from 16 to 11, you're letting in twice as much light. And if you go from 11 to 16, you're letting in half as much light. Now, these numbers are full stop changes, but you can make in between changes to let in less light or more light. And if you're using a lot of modern cameras, these numbers are changed automatically for you. In other words, the camera will change the f number to the appropriate opening to get the right exposure for you automatically.